Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of the Deep Dive December with the Impact Marathon series. It is so awesome to welcome you again to the third one. If you haven't had a chance, if you missed the first 2 episodes, that's all right. On our YouTube and on our Facebook, you can catch up. In the first episode, we had Saro Itate from Ceres in Guatemala talk to us all around young leadership programs across Guatemala and the history that means that it's such an important program that they're up to. We had on Sunday morning was awesome. We had Ergan Lama from Nepal and Child Reach Nepal teaching us how to make momos, which are an incredible Nepali dish that we all miss when we're not in Nepal. And today we have an amazing show ready and lined up for you with Rachel Lindley, the CEO of 5 Talents UK. Now, 5 Talents are our partner organisation for the Kenya Impact Marathon. But more than that, there would be no Kenya Impact Marathon were it not for Rachel and everything that she did in that first year. She came to me and said, what would it look like to have a race in Kenya supporting 5 Talents? And we went through a lot of different permutations and we had a lot of adventures along the way. So in this episode, we talk a bit about those adventures that we've had in the Kenya races, from how to put a race on during a Kenyan presidential election, to all of the different people that we've gotten to meet along the way in the 5 Talents programs. And I guess most importantly, we talked a lot about the work of 5 Talents. And I think that microfinance is a word that a lot of people have heard, but it's not always a word that a lot of people understand how it works. How do you implement these types of programs? And what exactly is the power of microfinance to change lives? So in this episode, we cover all of that and a lot more, and I hope you really enjoy it. And here is the Deep Dive December with Rachel Lindley. Obviously, Rachel, we've been working together on and off through this period since I think we first met in 2014.
Yeah, we did, didn't we? You went to Uganda.
Yes. Yeah. I was in Uganda and what is it? Neil, the chairman of 5 Talents, wanted me to do a little bit of work on at the project there. And I remember meeting you in London Bridge.
Yeah, Cafe Nero at London Bridge Station.
Yeah, and you trying to tell me everything you knew about 5 Talents in about 45 minutes, which I guess is where we can start today, is a bit about how did you journey from where you grew up to the point where you're now CEO of 5 Talents, and working extensively across East Africa and not just Kenya, but I guess a bit more about your story.
Yeah, well, I always wanted to do something like this. I'm one of the lucky people who's ended up doing something they absolutely love, but it took a while to get into it, as you well know. So I started off working for a community-based project, part of the Church of England, giving grants for community projects in the UK, so churches who were employing youth workers or putting in disabled toilets. I used to get sent a lot of pictures of toilets because that's what the grant money had been spent on. And that's a theme that continues through running and travelling. But I did that for about 4 years and then felt I wanted to do international community work, not UK based. So I quit my job and went and spent 6 months volunteering with a tiny NGO in Kenya called Maji, Missouri, which in fact we took the runners to go and see.
Yes.
That is the place where I realised this is really what I want to do. And it's where I first came across microfinance as well. So the charity had lots of different projects. It's one of these charities that sets up, the founder has an idea, sets up something and runs with it. It's grown enormously. So she began with a microfinance project because she was a social worker working at the University of Nairobi. She sent students on placements to Mathare Valley, one of the slums that we visited, and they all refused to go back again. So she went into the informal settlements to figure out why no one would come back. Talking to some women, went back the next week and none of them were there. And she figured out they'd been arrested because they were working as prostitutes. That's the only way they had to feed their children. So she went to the police station to pay bail for them, took them back to their homes. And one of them said to her, yeah, thank you for doing that. But the first thing I have to do now is find a man to sleep with so that I can put food on the table for tonight. So after that, she gradually quit being a university lecturer and set up a microfinance project so that these women could earn a living through a much more productive way. So the first group bought some mugs, some tea leaves, some milk. One of them lent a charcoal cooker and they started selling tea to earn a living for themselves. And as the projects grew, she realised that the children of those mothers were being left on their own, which isn't very safe. There's fires, there's sadly all sorts of things that go on. So she started a little nursery project for them, which became the school that you visited.
Mm-hmm.
So the project grew and grew, but that is where I first saw microfinance, and I thought, wow, this is incredible. I want to do this. So came back to the UK, did a master's, did 3 or 4 other jobs because it takes a long while to get anywhere, and then ended up with 5 talents.
And so, in the simplest terms, which is never too easy in the world of development, what is microfinance, and what is it about microfinance that you find so inspiring?
I could talk to you for hours about this. We'll save that for next time we're on a long bus ride together. But basically, the original concept of microfinance was Muhammad Yunus founding the Grameen Bank, all about making small loans to people. So rather than giving handouts all the time, lend some money to someone, they can invest it in a business, they can repay the loan, and they've earned their own living, so it's sustainable. 5 Talents has moved on from that, as indeed much of the sector has. So rather than making loans ourselves now, we form savings groups. So the community comes together, people in the village come together, they form their own community savings group, they elect their own leaders, they save their own money, and it's their own money that they're lending to one another. They make all their own decisions about who takes the loans, they set the interest rates, they make excellent credit decisions because it's their money. When there's a crisis like coronavirus, they then have savings to draw on. So people have been drawing on their emergency savings. But one of the biggest benefits of the groups that we see that they often mention is not the access to money. If you imagine you're a woman with 4 children, no way to feed them, husband's disappeared, living in a rural area, no work opportunities. What do you need? You need access to some capital so you can start your own business. You need access to some skills. So we do an awful lot of training as well, money management training, business skills training. But also the third thing you really need is to a support network, to some friends to bounce ideas off, friends to help you out, and people to talk to when your first and second and third businesses don't come good. People to support you when crises happen, because they do all the time. So one of the greatest strengths of these savings groups is the solidarity they form, the fact that people have friends to rely on. And when you've saved your money with someone, you trust them. So in our programme in South Sudan, we've introduced some trauma healing counselling because people have experienced hideous things in the conflicts there. And what we found is that trauma is a blocker. You can't start a business if you've experienced trauma because you're just not in the right place. Equally, when you join a savings group and you start planning for the future, that in itself is a healing act, because if you're saving, you're planning for tomorrow, you believe in tomorrow. Because you're talking about money, you find you can talk about other things as well. You can talk about domestic violence, you can talk about what you experienced in the war. So there's all sorts of tangential benefits. When you talk about microfinance, you think about banks and you think, well, that's not very exciting. But actually the really exciting stuff is about people being able to fulfill their own potential, really.
And how do you go about? So you've set up a project in South Sudan, and then it starts out with the savings process. That's going along. There's financial training, there's skill training, and then you get information like people aren't able to put their businesses together because of the trauma that they've experienced. What happens next? How do you then go about changing or tweaking that program?
So because we always work through local partners. We in the UK office, there's 5 of us. We sit around a table in one room normally, not right now, we're all at home now, but normally we sit around one table in one room. We don't deliver any of the programs ourselves, we deliver through our local partners who are all from the communities that we're working in. They're always connected with the Anglican Church because there's a church in every village that you could go to. Obviously they're open to people of all faiths and none. But it's those local leaders that are the key, because they know the communities and they know the needs. So the community will say, this is what we need, and then we'll try and find a way to walk with that.
And is that often the case of you needing to find the funding to finance that? What role do you then play at that point?
So not always, honestly, because the whole ethos of the savings groups is that people can do things themselves. So it's very tempting to rush in with a quick fix. You see a need, this community has no well, let's build them a well. No, let's not, because maybe there's one that's going to be built by the government a mile away, or maybe they've already had 3 wells and they've got polluted and they know that it's not going to work for them and they need a borehole instead. So it's easy for us to want to go and fix something. But what we've learned is that the thing to do is to facilitate discussions in the community. So the community sits down and says, what are our problems? What's causing them? What are the solutions? And what can we do about it? We being the group themselves. So then the group would say, you know, we don't have any clean water. What are we going to do about it? And then they would identify what's right for them to provide. And our role is really just facilitating those conversations and then helping them to realise that they can save, they can invest, they can use their skills. They've already got a huge amount of solidarity. So just helping them, you know, equipping them to solve their own problems.
That's fascinating. I hadn't actually thought about it from that perspective of we often have this challenge within Impact of do we work with organizations that are looking at that long-term systemic change that sort of is the prevention rather than cure. But when we're seeing a major challenge right here, what do we then do? Do we just focus on that preventative thing where we might not see results for some time? Or do we go in and say, okay, cool, these people, you know, this community doesn't have this, we will provide that. How do you, like, how does that look behind the scenes at Five Talents, and thoughts on it from obviously, you know, Impact Marathon? What are your thoughts on it from our perspective?
One of the things I love about Impact is the way that you are all about the local community, and you know, it's inevitable when we're all going to visit a community from the west and north, whatever you call it, we're bussed in for a week, there is inevitably some sense of us and them, but you go to huge lengths to try and eliminate that as far as possible, to make it all about us, to make it about the common elements of humanity we have, whether that's running or the projects or whatever it is. And I think that's one reason that Five Talents and Impact get on so well, because that's the Five Talents as well, that, you know, we are all the same. Some of us born in lots happier circumstances than others, but we are all the same. What you do when you see, it's honestly, it's so hard. I don't have the end. When I go to community and I hear that there's female genital mutilation happening, yeah, I want to stop it straight away. I want to stand up and say, what are you doing? That's completely wrong. Stop it. But that's not going to change anything. And I know it's not going to change anything. So what we would do instead is we would start these community conversations where the community starts talking about what's the barriers in our community, what are the things we want to tackle. And eventually we've had members of our groups go on to become, you know, female MPs, for example, or they've gone on to petition the elders to say, we don't want FGM here. So change does happen, but it's slow, and that's really hard because, you know, we're all human. We want to make things better for other people. And I don't know what the right balance is, honestly, between standing back and waiting or just diving in and trying to do something.
Yeah, and I think there's this element of you know, progress isn't linear, and we've seen that since, you know, so much throughout our lifetimes, but particularly now, I guess it's not a linear time. 2020 has been anything but, and you know, I think, you know, there's always, when you're in any career you take, you see the different challenges that's facing your industry or your sector. Within microfinance, within Five Talents, how do you see the changes in the challenges you had before, what the challenges are like presently during this period, but then also looking forward, what do you see as the, like, I guess, the long tail of the challenges faced now? And I guess we'll start with the challenges. We'll want to move on to optimism always, but I guess, like, what are the challenges and the transition of challenges through this 2020?
You know, as a UK charity, we have been very fortunate that our income has held up. Charities are all about fundraising, because if we're not fundraising, then we've got no projects. And many charities have been really hard hit. We feel very fortunate that we haven't. Our income has held up, and that's because we don't rely on massive events, we don't rely on charity shops, we don't rely on government funding, and we rely on a lot of individuals who have been and still are very generous. So we've managed to keep on supporting all of our projects. And the projects themselves, again, one of the great things about the model is that it's completely flexible, because the model is basically building community groups, and then those community groups decide what's right for them. So some of the groups stopped meeting altogether, obviously where there were lockdowns, they had to, and you all know many of the lockdowns were very strictly enforced, with people being arrested and beaten up if they broke them. So some of the groups did have to stop meeting, and that was really hard, because again, if you're not going out to work every day, generally you're not eating at night. So there were massive economic impacts for the communities. Others of them found ways to keep meeting. So, for example, they would say, well, there's 20 of us, let's get ourselves into groups of 3. One person will take the money to the treasurer, one person will collect all the paperwork and dish it out. So they found ways to adapt. Let's meet outdoors, let's sit at 2-meter intervals with face masks, let's get into soap making, and let's give that soap to other people in the village who can't afford to buy it. And so the groups themselves, they've got everything they need to respond to these kind of crises. Not that it was hard. Of course it was hard, and it was really hard for us sitting here in the UK saying, how do we get the balance right between advising our trainers to stop visiting groups, because we don't want our trainers to be super spreaders, but also we know the groups are needed more than ever because people need their emergency savings right now. They need loans to kickstart their businesses. People are going to be going hungry if they can't go to the market to sell their goods for the day. So again, really, really hard to get the balance right. But our approach is always ask them what they think is right, and that probably is right.
And Ed, have you seen, this is sort of, I guess, off the wall question, but we've seen obviously in our own communities, certain businesses and ideas have really, this has been a great moment. I mean, Zoom, for instance, which we're meeting on now. Have you seen beneficiaries who've had businesses that actually this was quite a good time for them? Yeah.
Yeah, so the ones you would expect, soap making, mask making, all those kind of things, of course, have been popular, but also market goods, because markets always had to close because they are essential food places. So people who have got market stores have been all right. I think the other thing is, though, that we've really noticed has been awareness. So the very remoteness that normally we always work in remote villages where there aren't any banks and there aren't any formal employment opportunities. And that remoteness normally is a barrier because you've got no access to market opportunities. But right now it's been a protection because there's been no coronavirus. But what we found is that means people haven't heard of coronavirus. If you don't have a television, you can't read and write, you don't have a radio, nobody comes, nobody goes, people don't know about it. And then when the lockdowns began to ease and people from the urban areas were going back to the villages, again, we were very worried about a second wave as people from the urban areas brought it back. So we did a lot of health awareness training. We didn't, our partners did a lot of health awareness training, teaming up with doctors and health workers, just to share all the messages that we all know about washing your hands, keeping your distance, all that kind of thing. So I think the education side has been really important as well as the business side.
And I guess coming as you've been speaking, it's been in my mind that most of the coverage in the media that we've seen around this has been very inward looking. We've heard all about what's happening in the UK, the NHS, and that's great. And I'm sure every country, from everyone who's tuning in, has had the same experience. You remind me the countries that Five Talents works across, and I guess also just where things are right now across the board, and then we'll probably move on from too much on coronavirus.
On the topic of 2020, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, DR Congo, Burundi, South Sudan, and then Myanmar and Bolivia, which are slight geographical outliers. Bolivia has been really hard hit, as much of Latin America has. Things are still really bad there. But our trainers there, they've started just doing training through WhatsApp messages. Most people have WhatsApp there, so they've started doing business skills training in WhatsApp chunk-sized messages. Also, just loads of encouragement and support. You're not on your own. We'll get through this. That kind of message, which I think has been helpful for the trainers as well as for the community. The picture across Eastern Africa, as you'll know, is it's massively varied within each country, let alone between the countries. Tanzania, there's not much data coming out of. They had elections this week. There's been quite a lot of political repression, and Tanzania stopped reporting to the World Health Organization, the president declared, coronavirus is over, let's have a party. So it's been quite hard to know what's really happening there. That means I've been able to keep meeting because there have been very few restrictions, but we've asked them to put in place some sensible restrictions. And what we found that's been really valuable is, because we're a church project, and it might surprise UK listeners to hear this, but the church is really, really trusted in many of the places where we work. So the communities have trusted the health advice that our partners have been giving because they're seen as connected with the church. So they've actually taken it on board rather than listening to the president's advice, which is can't catch coronavirus, let's have a party. So that's been strangely encouraging. Burundi also had elections in May, which went peacefully, but there wasn't much data coming out around the time of the elections. I suspect because no one wants to be voted for when there's a coronavirus crisis. It feels a bit ironic saying that on the 3rd of November when America is today. South Sudan put in place a fairly strict curfew. Most of the spreading there was happening through INGOs. DR Congo, we work in northeast DR Congo. There were lots of cases in Kinshasa where we worked, there were very few. And I think because they'd grappled with Ebola, they found it in some ways much easier than us to adapt to this kind of situation. Even the most humble mud and thatch home you can imagine still has a hand washing point. They have a jerry can with some soap on string, one of those tippy tap things or something. So washing your hands is just second nature there. And they also had really, really good contact tracing. Again, without wishing to draw any parallels with our own systems, but there was one case that came in to DR Congo across the border from Uganda. They found the guy, they tried to chuck him out because they didn't want him. Anyway, they did take him to hospital, but then they traced every single person he'd been in contact with. They isolated for 14 days. They had no testing equipment, but they had a really good isolating and tracing system. And they've not had any more cases. So,
wow.
As you were saying, there's been so much coverage of our culture, and the coverage there has been for, let's say, DR Congo is generally these people won't cope because they're poor and they don't have the health systems that we have, which is, it's true. Of course, the number of intensive care beds is practically zero, but the coping strategies they have from the experience they've had of other crises is way ahead of ours. I must share it with you. There's a really fascinating article about you. We should all be doing a lot more learning from the places that we tend to look down on as being less developed than us, which, yeah, I'm sure you've done a lot of reading on the whole to Charity So White movement as well. I'm digressing now, but there's so much we should be learning from our partner countries rather than assuming we know the answers.
Absolutely. And I think that's also just part of the journey that you go on as a foreign organization working abroad. That experience of having an idea or a conception, going in and realizing how wrong you were, that humbling experience. But then I think also there's a challenge in there that I've found, which is then how do you then communicate that to whether it's the impact runners or your donors or the public at large without sort of sounding in some way preaching, or that communication of okay, this is I thought the same, but I went and then I realized that this was totally wrong, when especially that was the case in this community, but the community is so different. I don't know how you guys, and I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit was within that, we've seen this week Comic Relief come out and say that they're no longer going to send celebrities over, and they're going to use more local storytellers, which is something that both of organizations work with Adam Dickings and taking pictures, changing lives, and what he's doing with his local photographers. How do you look at storytelling as a foreign entity telling stories of different countries? What are the main misconceptions that you find, and then how do you communicate and take people on that journey?
I mean, it's really hard. We've always resisted poverty porn, as they call it. Our imagery has always been, thanks to Adam, incredibly positive, because our ethos is all about everybody can do this. People are not poor, they're just born in crappy situations, and all they need is an opportunity to use their skills, to use their talents, God-given talents if you're religious, talents if you're not, but to use their talents. All they need is an opportunity to unlock that. So our imagery has always been very positive, but we've been doing a lot of reading recently on white saviour syndrome, white gaze, and we're guilty of it too. Of course we are. We can't not be. We're trying hard to be better, but we need to look at ourselves and look at our content gathering approaches and how we present people. Are we putting words in people's mouths? Are people really telling their own stories? Are we perpetuating some of this West knows best stereotype? And it's a long colonial story, really. It goes a long way back. So we've got a long way to go, but at least it's in the national conscious now. At least people have heard of what white saviour complex is.
And I think, how have you found that as a foreign CEO? How have you, and especially one from Britain working in, we'll continue to kind of focus on Kenya here, just because that's our I guess our common place. How do you find that as a foreign CEO, as a British CEO, with the colonial history? Is there things that you've come up against where there's still potential upset about that, or
Mhm.
and I guess as
Mhm.
well into that is as well as your role as a female CEO,
Mm.
and how you found conceptions around that in Kenya, and also I guess in Britain to some degree.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. There are plenty of gatherings I go to in the City of London where I am in a minority, being female, and being, I can't say under 40 anymore, but under 50. In Kenya, one of my colleagues has this saying, foreigners are forgiven. And she's so right, is, the Kenyan culture is so unbelievably gracious that even when people are, a Kenyan person will be very aware of colonial history and will have suffered from it probably. Their forebears will have suffered from some of the things that British forces did. Equally, they'll have benefited from some of them. I'm not saying it's a black and white issue at all, but generally our partners are so unbelievably gracious that they don't hold it over us. And I don't know how not. I think if my grandparents had been in a concentration camp in Kenya, I would struggle to welcome people into my village. And if people rocked up in my village with more money in their pocket for a day than I earn in 6 months, again, I would struggle to share my meal with them and welcome them with singing and dancing. But as you know, that's what happens. People are incredibly, incredibly gracious. But I, in ways, that's a disservice. I think we all ought to be having more honest conversations, and I haven't found a way to do it. Even after, how long have I been with Five Talents? 8 years or so. So some of my colleagues in Kenya, we know each other really well. They stay in my house, I stay in their house. We've spent a lot of time together. Even then, I don't think we have had that many honest conversations about how I, as Rachel, have screwed up, because I will have done. The time things wrong, they generally won't tell me. And the times that Britain, for example, has screwed up vis-a-vis Kenya historically. So I would love us to have more honest conversations about that.
And there's something that I want to kind of build off onto in terms of our shared experience in the first year, but how do you think you can go about starting that conversation? I mean, it's so hard because even starting it is us saying, right, we are now ready to talk about this or whatever. And as we said, we never want it. There's this goal of trying to create an us and a natural thing. How do you feel about starting that? Is that something that can be instigated from Five Talents?
I think it's as you say, it's about creating the us, and it's something that you guys do really, really well, because you take a group of people who already have a shared passion for running and already have a shared sense of adventure, and those kind of people are generally willing to try and build relationships. They're willing to try and meet the communities and genuinely engage with them. But it's really hard to do in a week, isn't it? It's really hard to do. I think it's about people being open-minded, and as you know, once you've been on one of these trips, generally your mind is blown wide open, and that's got to be a good thing. That's got to be a good thing. Mine is still blown wide open, and I must have been, not this year, but usually I'm going 3 or 4 times a year. Time I learn something new, and I come back with a greater sense of mind openedness, and that's got to be a good place to start, I think. But what do you think? I'm doing all the talking. You tell me what you think.
For me, there was this time, and I think when we think back to the first race that we did in Kenya, we were in a place in Kenya that we'd never really expected. The election had happened in July, August time, and there's been a presidential election. I'd lived in Nairobi during that time, and watching the news, listening, learning, and I think as well, much as anything, sitting and having a whiskey with someone and genuinely just chatting about that stuff. And I feel like those late night conversations that I had were some of the most interesting, and certainly there was an openness and a discussion, and you learned more. And I certainly learned more around that concept that we're looking upon an election in Kenya, and we're worried about violence, and we're worried about it being fair and free, and then you put it in the context that the democracy is only 50 years old. And I don't think I'd ever really thought about it from that perspective at all, in terms of this is a 50-year-old concept that was an imposition in many, if not all ways. And so as Kenya transitioned, democracy was the only option to run the country. And so if you look back at the early days of a British democracy, we had exactly the same challenges. We had civil wars, we had debate, we had these things. And I think that when I think back to that first year in terms of how much did I learn, and those conversations around Britain's past in Kenya came up over those whiskies in the evening. They came up, and it was really just the biggest learning few months of my life, both in terms of impact and also in terms of my own concepts around that past and that history, and coming to terms with it, which is something that, if I talk to that older generation, the generation that lived through the war in my family, they would certainly be saying about the positives that we was left behind. And that alone is a big question mark over whether that is, but it was more around just understanding that we stand on those shoulders, and our interactions therein with every race has been far more considered in terms of how much we want to take a step back and just say, this is not our story to tell anymore. And I think that first year, trying to tell the story of the Kenyan election, from my point of view, all I could do was relay the facts of what we knew, rather than it felt very difficult to then allay the underlying 50, 60, 100, 200 year history that led up to this moment. How was it for you during that period? Just to put the final picture of that, was the election happened in August. 6 weeks or so after the election, the Supreme Court nullified the result, set a date for a re-election. That then actually got pushed back 1 week, which meant that election day landed on our race day in October, months afterwards. And we were left sort of freestyling behind the scenes to keep it all working. And it turned out that to be a remarkable, the changes we had to make because of the election actually turned out to be what made the race, and the second year made the race so much better than I guess we'd imagined. But that did mean that behind the scenes, Rachel and I were constantly kind of tweaking and changing and all the way through the run up. And I guess that question of what was learned through that, and what was that like from your perspective, because Five Talents tell the story of the week a lot more than Impact do in that scenario.
Well, I mean, you thrive on a crisis, Nick, don't you? So you were the one who was doing all the running around and fixing everything. And we were very glad to have you there doing that. But in terms of the experience for the runners, hats off to them for coming. I mean, I always say it's an enormous privilege to travel. I feel so fortunate I've travelled so much, because you learn so much. And back to what we were saying earlier, you set off thinking, I'm going to go and change the world. And actually every trip you make, you realise that you're changed and you've taken from it. What have you given? That's probably more questionable. So it's a huge privilege. That said, it's also pretty adventurous of people, and very generous of people to give a week of their annual leave, a week of their holiday money, and to travel somewhere where they're not going to be having a luxury 5-star holiday, and they are going to be contending with potential political unrest, violence, cancellations, evacuations, blah, 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 blah. And again, that brings you into the realm of, well, we could get evacuated and the local communities can't, and that's a whole other moral dilemma. But I think it makes it a whole lot more memorable, and I think it's just real, isn't it? This kind of political crisis, unrest. We've had an email from our partner in northern Uganda just this week saying one of the groups had to cancel its meeting because there was cattle raiding. People came with guns. Everyone had to go home and make sure their cattle were safe, and then they didn't want to come back because there were people around with guns. Now, that's pretty traumatic. If that happened in my village where I'm staying right now, it would be front of every newspaper in the UK. But for them, it's not really news. It happens all the time. Just to open our eyes to the fact that what seems to us like a massive crisis is normal life for many, many people, and they have to get on and live through that because that's what they do. And they can't evacuate after a week or a day or whatever and go home to their 5-star homes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was definitely the case, leading up to the election that year. Everyone was like, oh no, we'll be heading out for election period. We never stay in Kenya for election period. And I didn't have any other option. But it was really such a fascinating time to live through an election. And I guess that brings us a little bit onto the Impact Marathon itself. You've now I mean, we wouldn't be in, like, literally was no, I didn't have Kenya as a place necessarily on the list that we were going to put a race in. But you sort of driven it from day one and made it happen in those first years. And what was it that actually, because you're an incredible runner, let's talk a little bit about your running journey and what running means in your life. You've done ultras, you've done all sorts. Yeah, what is running to you? Why did you get into it? What does running mean to you?
I have always run, and I feel, again, so incredibly fortunate that I have running as part of my life, because it gives you so much. It just gives you so much. Space, feeling good, sense of perspective, chance to meet other wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. It is something that crosses boundaries as well. We've both spent time with Ben Rotich, for example. Obviously, he's far better than either of us could ever be, but we have something in common. So yeah, running it's a huge part of my life, and I love the chance to talk about it. It's one reason this marathon is so perfect for me, because I love Five Talents, I love Kenya, I love running. So I get to, do all three, and I get to introduce other people to all of them. It's such a privilege.
You mean we've seen all sorts of people come and run that route? I get it. Yeah. What is it? That route's a sort of a quirky one, because we as we said, because of the election, we never meant to be having it where we did in Chesumot Estate. How do you find the course?
I love it, and it's rare of me to say that, because I hate laps. I'm not a lap. These crazy people who do 24 hours of 1 mile loops or whatever. No. I like A to B, where you feel like you've got somewhere. So when you first told me it was going to be 4 laps, I wasn't very enthusiastic, but it's so beautiful. It's just so beautiful. And every time you come up to that top point and see out over the Rift Valley, yeah, just so beautiful.
I learned something the other day about the Rift Valley, that it's still moving apart. I didn't realize that. Yeah, so that millions of years in the future, that Rift Valley will in fact probably be an actual rift as well. Which anyway, I mean that's not something we need to worry about in this in our lifetimes for sure. But I mean that course, because I always try and make it less laps. We had the 4 laps from year one, because we had to make that work, and it was a safe place and it worked, and they already had an 11k route. And I tried it before to try and make it 2, and you end up sort of, it doesn't quite have that same energy as everyone on every distance being out there. And I think because we have the elites who come and use it as a training day almost, that there's something about that. So you'll get that experience all around the course.
Yeah, I wouldn't change it now.
Really?
I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't, because as you say, it's lovely to be able to see people so many times as well. The walkers, the runners, the 10k, the half people.
You managed to speak to everybody last year, didn't you?
I tried. I think I did. Yeah, it's great. It's so lovely, so lovely. It's just nice to share the experience with people, and I find it so inspirational when people are doing their first marathon as well. You think, you picked this as your first marathon, you crazy person. So the chance to share a bit of that with them is very cool.
Well, I remember it was Kit Garnett in year 2 who and so if year 1 was defined by the word election, year 2 was defined by the word hailstorm. Because in the middle of the race day, I mean, it must be 5 minutes. Was it 5 minutes where it went from blue sky to gray sky?
Something like that.
Hail sky. And there we were, and we were making the changes, and Kit was outside running around the hut to finish off his marathon, because he's like, I came here to run a marathon. I thought was extraordinary. And I think that's it. There's so many different reasons why people are out there running, and I feel that on every race I ever do, let alone impact marathons, you just get so inspired by the different reasons why people run. And I think that's something that I've noticed through the amount of people that are joining Strava suggests to me that casual running is really on the up through lockdown. And at the moment, obviously UK is back in, is about to enter, is back in that period. Just seeing that running is touching more lives actually through this period is something I think.
I hope so. It's been one of my saving graces through lockdown. I'm sure it has as well. Just with my running club, doing distance events, virtual events, just running on my own or running with another person when we've been allowed to. It's makes a massive difference to mental health, I think, as well as physical health.
And we've seen, because we're obviously involved in running clubs in lots of different countries, in Kathmandu in particular, where it was not allowed out of your house. You had to get a permit just to leave the house. There, every weekend they were coming up with a Saturday challenge, and that was, one time someone did Everest in 24 hours up and down the steps in his house. But even so, even if it was just the kids going back and forward in their lanes outside that, all of these things, and it was just, it was great. It was a privilege to sort of be part of that. Even though, in the UK we were allowed to go out, and I'm here in Pembrokeshire National Park, so I couldn't have a better sort of trail running spot. But I did those runs inside the house and inside the garden with the different running groups that we're involved in. It's definitely been something that has really inspired me throughout this period, is seeing people coming up with the different challenges, and challenging us to look forward as to what we want impact events to be in the future as well. And what it can be.
What are you thinking about that?
Well, we had the virtual event back in April where we did our Nottingham, which was brilliant. We had sunrise shots from all over the world. It was such an amazing,
cool.
Amazing time. But we never wanted to do too much around virtual events, because I think a lot of events organizations focused in on that, and we felt like that wasn't, because the run isn't what makes an Impact Week so special. We didn't want to sort of try and recreate it just through running challenges. So we focused a bit more on taking a step back and looking at what impact can be in the future. And around, we've got, I think we've talked about it, sort of alluded to it a number of times. We've got this model whereby international runners join us in a country somewhere, and we run an amazing race, and we have an incredible experience, and we visit the projects and we learn lots. And something that's always bugged me is that the model is reliant on international participation. And I think in the countries that we've worked in so far, over these 5 years, we've seen so much every year, the number of local runners wanting to be involved in the projects, talented race directors who want who've got loads of ideas. And we've also seen the standard and quality of the races in each country go up so high, to the point where impact coming in for 1 month or 2 months, actually we can do so much more if we with by letting our race directors out there become the leaders of the race and do it all year round and come up with new ideas and concepts, and also just getting more of the local runners engaged in the community. And that for me has been our exciting looking forward to go, okay, cool, that we can look at this from a completely different angle. That model we had is still there. We're never going to change that. That's a fantastic part of what we do, and I love it. But there's almost like a missed opportunity over here to look at how we can get I've always wanted to, but never known how. And so this time off, so to speak, has given us opportunity to get, okay, how can we have communities using these races to drive their problems or their challenges, or most importantly, their solutions forward.
I've often thought about it, because you are, in some ways, you're a whole lot more than a travel company, but you are a travel company, and 2020 has not been good for travel companies, and increasing focus on environment has got to say something to travel companies. But a way to kind of marry that to the shift the power movement, as they call it in the NGO sector, which is, as you're saying, all about shifting the power. It's not us in the West who should have the power, it's people in the communities who should have the power to solve their own solutions. So taking the running and the travel that you do to make it focused around the communities.
I mean, I think when we set up Impact, the goal was never to be a travel organization. It was to use running as a tool. So when you go back to that original mission, the fact is this has been a really incredible model, but and will, as I said, continue to be so. But there's just loads of different angles, and there's so much more of a platform, and working with Adam on the storytelling side of things. And then we've used lots of amazing videographers in each country who are telling stories from a Guatemalan perspective, from a Kenyan perspective. And so it just feels like there's some, it feels like it's exactly the right time to transition that. And conversations like we're having now is stuff that we've talked about behind closed doors for too long. And actually, I feel like more open conversations, more telling of stories from all the different perspectives is something that I want us to do more of, for sure.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
that doesn't involve getting on an airplane and traveling across the world,
Yeah,
but it can do, and it will
it
do.
can.
And like, there is something absolutely amazing about race day when you see all of the different countries and the cultures. I think we had over 20 different countries represented in Guatemala this year,
Yeah,
and that's just there's no energy like that, and I can't wait to be out there having an event
yeah,
again, because
yeah, for
it's
sure.
exciting and fun.
It really
But
is. It really is. Yeah.
I mean, what are yours? I guess a question is, like, what are your, if you could pick out one moment from the Kenya Impact Marathon experiences, like, what is your craziest moment and your favorite moment?
Oh
You
man.
can do it whichever order you need to do that in.
They're probably the same actually. But no, I mean, my favourite moment of all of them is seeing people bond. I love it. You get a bus full of strangers who rock up jet lagged and knackered and not knowing each other's names on day one. And then by day three, there's nothing they won't talk about with each other, from what breakfast did to their stomachs to what they believe about colonialism. It's, yeah, I love it. I think that's my favourite thing, seeing strangers bond to become friends.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with it anymore on that. That's what makes it so addictive. That buzz of in that first night, everyone nervous chatting and the small talk and all of this, and by the end of the week, blimey, there's nothing. And then you see them, different people meeting up around the world, and it's just really cool to see that started from a bit of small talk on a bus in Kenya.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
To be
craziest
part of
moment.
people experiencing their first visit to somewhere like the places that we work as well, always mind blowing for me. Because I think you and I have been many, many times, and I do mean it when I say I learn something new every time, but you do also get familiar. And it's really grounding to see people experience it for the first time, and you realise, I hope I'm never not shocked by this, because I should be shocked by some of the things that we still see. But the fact is that people come inspired more than shocked. The whole game, this whole no poverty porn thing, when you speak to people who've had their first ever trip to a community where people don't have enough to eat, they are humbled and sad, but they've got something positive to do with it. They're not seeing themselves as the person taking photographs to put on Facebook with their arms around children. To do more than that, they genuinely want to try and understand, why is this happening? So many questions that we get asked, and we don't have all the answers, but the fact that people want to ask the questions, I think is great.
And do you find that there's a more engaged conversation at that point than if you were to tell someone about the project? What do you feel like the difference is when someone's actually gone and visited a Five Talents project to when they've been told about it?
There's no substitute, is there, for seeing it running? If you describe a race to someone, it's not the same as them doing it themselves. It's the same. I can talk till I'm blue in the face about our work. Tell you no end of stories about women whose lives have been incredibly changed by the projects. But that's completely different from you actually talking to someone and hearing it from themselves, and looking around and smelling and seeing and just being there, just experiencing it. There's something about experiencing it.
And I guess it's the people are outside of their worlds now, and it's a time for them to actually pause and ask those questions. Whereas when we talk about it from, and it's in the middle of a meeting day or whatever, you're then back into the world. Your kids are screaming and you've got to do all this, and actually taking people out. I think, it creates a space where people can embrace. And I guess a final question for you is, what gives you optimism right now? I think it's a really, obviously we've got, even if we took out COVID from this current present situation, as you said earlier, we are talking about this on the 3rd of November. It is election day. I guess we can record two endings if we need to, but I'm always seeking to find what makes you optimistic about the future of development, the future of humanity, even at this stage. I think it's not unfair for us to ask that question.
I'm an incredibly optimistic person. I am optimistic because people are essentially good. people all over the world, and we have seen the best of people in this period. You know, there's a few people who are buying up every toilet roll that they can find, but there's a whole lot more people who are donating to food banks and calling their neighbours and getting to know people for the first time. I think the sense of community that we often envy when we're in a village in Kenya, we have learnt a bit of the value of here. And every day in my work, I meet good people because I have so many supporters. I can't tell you how wonderful it is when the post arrives in the morning at our office and you open it and there's a cheque for £500 from someone, someone who sat down and written a cheque to contribute to the work. It's just incredibly humbling to be someone who can connect that woman who's written me a £500 cheque and a woman in a village in DR Congo who's learnt to read for the time and is now setting up a business and sending her children to school. And the world is full of good people like that. So, I am optimistic.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat through your story, a little bit about impact story as well within there. And thanks so much, Rachel.
No, thank you, Nick. It was an exciting adventure all those years ago, and we're going to do it again.
Yes, absolutely.